I asked my daughter if I could stay in her guest room for a few days while I recovered from heart surgery. Her husband sneered. "We're not running a hospice for useless old men." My own daughter agreed. "You're not just a burden, Dad, you're a liability." They canceled my insurance, forged my signature, and waited for my heart to stop beating so they could sell my house. What they didn't know, the same week they left me to die, I inherited $45 million and became the majority owner of the corporation they worked for. By morning, I didn't need their roof, I owned their world. Welcome to Family Revenge Stories. Thank you so much for being here and spending your time with me today. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? I love seeing how far these stories travel and imagining all of us connected across different cities and countries. Also, a brief disclaimer, this narrative includes fictional elements woven in for storytelling and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual individuals, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. But the message about family power and consequences is meant to inspire reflection. "Get out of my house, you useless old anchor!" The words hit me harder than a construction beam to the chest. But it wasn't the insult that broke my heart. It was the silence from my own daughter standing right behind him. I am Thane Garrison, a 67-year-old former site supervisor with hands calloused by decades of steel and concrete, now standing silently in the shadows of a home I helped buy, but no longer belong in. My legs felt heavy, the rhythm of my own heart staccato and betraying, as I looked at the man towering over me in the hallway. Beckett Hayes, my son-in-law, leaned against the doorframe with a smirk that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes, looking every bit the predatory climber he was. He adjusted the cuff of his silk shirt, the sharp click of his designer watch, marking the seconds of my humiliation. I turned my gaze toward Alara, my only daughter. She stood there with the polished air of a woman who had never known a day of hard labor. Her eyes fixed only on her designer watch, as if my presence were a scheduled delay she couldn't afford. It was January, and the Naperville air was already biting through the thin walls of the mudroom. "Alara," I whispered, my voice sounding older than I felt. "I gave you the deposit for this very roof over your head. I am not asking for much, just a place to recover until the doctors clear me." I saw her hand tighten around the strap of her handbag, using it like a shield. I realized then that she hadn't just forgotten to pay back the $80,000 loan I gave them for this place. I had seen her private phone on the counter earlier. The screen had lit up with a missed call from my cardiologist, a number she had intentionally blocked to avoid hearing about my failing health. "Do you have any idea what your episodes are doing to our social life?" Thane Beckett barked, stepping closer. The smell of his expensive cologne, something woody and arrogant, filled the narrow space. "We are trying to build a reputation here. We can't have you collapsing in the foyer every time we host a dinner party. You are bleeding us dry with the extra heating, the special meals, and the constant gloom you bring into this house. Is this what 40 years of sweat and steel bought me? A front row seat to my own disposal." I looked at my hands, the scars from rebar and heavy machinery still visible, and wondered where I had failed as a father. Alara finally looked up, but there was no warmth in her eyes. "Dad Beckett is right," she said, her voice clinical and detached. "We can't keep setting our own future on fire to keep you warm. We have a lifestyle to maintain, and having a medical liability in the guest room isn't part of the plan. I'm not a bill to be paid." "Alara," I replied, a spark of my old supervisor grit flickering in my chest. "I am your father. I am the man who worked double shifts in the rain so you could go to the university that taught you how to look down on me." She didn't flinch. She just stepped back, allowing Beckett to take the lead. He reached out and grabbed the lapel of my jacket. Then came the shove. Hard. Cold. Final. My boots skidded on the hardwood, and before I could regain my balance, I was reeling backward toward the open front door. Beckett leaned in close, his breath hot against my face. "Don't worry, old man. I've already been scouting autumn leaves for you. It's a place where they know how to handle anchors like you. In fact, I've already listed your bungalow for lease. I don't need your signature to start collecting the rent." The heavy oak door slammed shut, the lock clicking with a finality that echoed in the rainy street. I stood there shivering in a thin jacket, clutching a plastic bag of heart meds that were about to run out. The emergency room lights didn't feel like a sanctuary. They felt like the white, cold eyes of a judge passing a final sentence on a man who had already lost everything. I was shivering on a wet bench outside a closed pharmacy when the world began to tilt. The freezing rain had soaked through my jacket, and the plastic bag of heart medication I clutched felt like an anchor dragging me into the pavement. Every breath was a struggle against a heavy, jagged weight in my chest. I remember flagging down a car, the headlights blinding me before the darkness swallowed the Chicago street whole. When I woke, the smell of antiseptic and floor wax hit me first, followed by the high-pitched, steady ping of a heart monitor that told me I was still alive, however barely. A nurse moved with curt efficiency around my bed, checking my vitals with the practiced indifference reserved for patients who lack a premium insurance card. "Deep breaths, mister." "Garrison," she said without looking at me. "You are lucky someone saw you." Lucky, that was one word for it. I reached for the plastic bag of meds I had been carrying, but she had already set them aside. My dry, metallic taste in the back of my throat made me cough. When I looked at the bottle, the blood in my veins turned to ice. Beckett hadn't just kicked me out. He had sabotaged me while I was still under his roof. The expensive aortic regulators I needed to survive were gone. In their place, the capsules were nothing but cheap caffeine supplements. He had replaced my lifeline with junk, just to save a few dollars on the household budget. Life is like a skyscraper. You spend years pouring the foundation, only for the people you built it for to set fire to the penthouse while you are still in the basement. I closed my eyes as the door creaked open. "Doctor?" Miller adjusted his spectacles with the practiced disappointment of a man who had seen too many good men broken by bad luck. His white coat crisp against the grime of my reality. He didn't offer a smile. Instead, he pulled up a tablet, and the cold touch of his stethoscope against my chest felt like lead. "Thane, we are past the point of medication now." He said, his voice a low rumble in the sterile room. "Your aortic valve is failing faster than we anticipated. You need the replacement surgery. Now." I stared at him, my heart monitor skipping a beat. $150,000 I've spent my life building skyscrapers. Miller and you are telling me I can't even afford to keep my own heart beating. He sighed, tapping the screen. "Without this surgery, your heart will stop within 12 months, maybe less." It was a death sentence with a price tag attached. $150,000. That was the cost of my life. To Alara, it was probably just the price of a mid-sized kitchen renovation. I felt a surge of nausea that had nothing to do with my heart. I told the doctor that my insurance through the site supervisors union should cover the bulk of it. "Doctor." Miller paused, a shadow of genuine pity crossing his face as he looked at the billing notes on his tablet. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Thane." I checked the policy on file. It was canceled 2 weeks ago. I froze. Cancelled. That's impossible. He turned the screen toward me, showing a digital signature on a welfare power of attorney form. The name was Ilara Garrison. She had used the authority I gave her when I first got sick to sever my safety net while I was sleeping in her guest room. My own daughter had pulled the plug before I was even on the table. Doctor, Miller looked at me with pity, but pity doesn't pay for surgical-grade valves. Thane, he whispered, if you can't find the funds by the end of the month, we have to move you to palliative care. The walk back to my empty bungalow felt like a march to a graveyard, each step vibrating through my weakened chest, like a heavy hammer against hollow steel. I didn't turn on the lights. In the dark, the bungalow felt less like a home and more like a waiting room for a death I couldn't afford to pay off. The silence of the house pressed against my ears, heavy with the weight of memories that now felt like betrayals. I made my way to my small office, guided by the familiar layout of a life I had built with my own 2 hands. My fingers found the locked metal box under the floorboards, its surface cold and smelling of old paper and dust. Inside lay the 2020 loan agreement for $80,000 I had given Ilara for her house deposit. I could still hear her voice echoing in the shadows of this room. It is just a loan, Dad, she had said, leaning over my shoulder. I will have it back to you in 2 years, tops the second the company goes public. 4 years later, and all I have is a piece of paper and a failing heart. As I reviewed the document by the dim light of my flip phone, I noticed a small forged amendment at the bottom dated just last month. It claimed the loan had been converted to a gift. The signature was a crude imitation of my own, likely done by Beckett during his last visit while I was naping. The realization felt like acid in my throat. How much is a father's life worth on the open market? Apparently the price of a suburban house deposit and a forged signature. I sat there in the dark, clutching the paper that was supposed to be my surgical deposit, feeling the cold air seep through the window frames. I had sacrificed my retirement and my late wife's savings to ensure Ilara had the best life, never imagining she would be the one to pull the safety net from under me. I walked into the living room, my eyes landing on a framed photo of us at her graduation. We were both smiling, her in her gown, and me in my best suit, looking like a man who had finally reached the summit. I picked up the house phone to call her one last time, a desperate hope flickering that maybe, just maybe, I had misjudged her. The number you are calling has been changed, or is no longer in service. Liar, I whispered to the dial tone. You didn't change the number. You just changed your father's status to disposable. I wasn't just losing my heart. I was losing my ground. Literally. As I went to put the graduation photo back, I noticed a hidden envelope tucked behind the frame. It wasn't a bill or a personal note. It was a legal notice from a local developer. Beckett hadn't just listed my bungalow for lease while I was at the hospital. He had already accepted a predatory cash offer to bulldoze this entire lot for a parking complex. The document stated that since I was mentally incompetent, the sale was being finalized by Ilara as my guardian. My blood turned to ice. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were actively clearing the site for my funeral before the body was even cold. I struck a match, the scratch against the box sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. The orange glow of the dying flame illuminated my trembling hands. As I held the graduation photo over the sink, I watched the flame lick the corner of the paper until the smiling faces of my daughter and I curled into black ash. I didn't feel the grief anymore. I felt the cold, hard clarity of a site supervisor surveying a collapsed structure. You want a war over this house, Beckett? I whispered into the dark, watching the last spark vanish. You have got one. The headlights of a luxury SUV swept across my living room wall, signaling the arrival of the wolves. The roar of a new Mercedes-Benz engine cutting out in my front yard was a declaration of war. I had barely finished sweeping the black ash of my daughter's graduation photo from my hands when the front door flew open. Beckett Hayes didn't bother knocking. He stepped into my sanctuary with a sneer, his expensive leather shoes clacking loudly on the hardwood floor I had polished just last week. He paused, sniffing the air as if he had just walked into a dumpster. "God Thane, does it always smell like old people and damp rot in here?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. He moved through the room with an arrogance that made my blood simmer. I stood my ground, my calloused hands tightening into fists at my sides. He didn't ask how I felt after being shoved into a storm. He didn't ask if my heart was still beating. Instead, he adjusted his sleeve, and that was when I saw it. A glint of gold and sapphire caught the dim light. It was a brand new Rolex, the kind that costs more than a mid-sized sedan. I recognized the model immediately. Ilara had mentioned it months ago. Last month, she told me she couldn't afford to renew my medical insurance because she had to pay a massive back tax for my benefit. Now I knew exactly where that premium money had gone. It was currently ticking away on the wrist of the man who wanted me dead. "Do you have any idea how much it costs to support a useless mouth in this economy?" Beckett snapped, turning to face me. He didn't wait for a response before launching into a verbal audit of my existence. "We are bleeding cash because of your prescriptions and the extra utilities you used during your stay at our place. This house is a drain, Thane. A relic. Can you believe it? The man insulting me over a loaf of bread is wearing a fortune built from my own sweat." I stared at him, my voice low and steady. "This house still has my name on the deed, Beckett. You are standing in my living room. Act like a guest or get out." He laughed, a dry, grating sound that echoed in the quiet bungalow. "Don't bring up old favors, Thane. You're nothing but a liability on our balance sheet now. Ilara is working herself to the bone trying to fix the mess you've made of your retirement." He reached into his coat and tossed a thick stack of bills onto the coffee table. The paper hit the wood with a dull thud. "We're done playing nursemaid. If you don't cooperate with the sale of this lot and move into the assisted living facility we've picked out, we're cutting you off completely. No more meds, no more grocery deliveries, nothing." I looked at the bills, then back at him. "You view your father-in-law as a debt to be settled?" I asked. He stepped closer, his expensive cologne thick enough to choke the air out of my lungs. "I view you as a hurdle," he whispered. "A hurdle that needs to be cleared so we can actually start our lives." He looked at his watch again, the Rolex shimmering in the gloom. He smiled, then a cold, sharp expression that made the hair on my neck stand up. He was so confident, so sure of his victory, that his guard slipped just for a second. "We've already spoken to the attorneys, Thane. It won't be hard to prove you're mentally incompetent after that little episode in the rain. Once the court grants Ilara guardianship, your signature won't matter anymore. We'll have the house and you'll have a nice, quiet room with padded walls. Enjoy your last night in this house. The surveyors will be here on Monday morning." He turned on his heel and walked out, the engine of his Mercedes roaring back to life. I watched the red taillights fade into the darkness, my hand reaching into my pocket to touch the loan agreement from 2020. He thinks he's cornered a dying old man. He doesn't realize that a cornered grizzly is the most dangerous thing in the woods. The morning sun had barely begun to bleed through the gray February clouds when the pounding started. I did not wait for Monday to come to me, and apparently neither did they. The rhythmic thuds against my front door at 6 o'clock in the morning were not the sounds of a polite visitor. They were the heavy footfalls of vultures coming to claim a body that was still warm. I sat up in bed, my heart laboring under the sudden rush of adrenaline, a sharp reminder from my failing valve that I no longer had the luxury of being startled. I pulled on my old flannel robe and made my way to the door, the floorboards groaning under my weight, as if the house itself were bracing for the intrusion. When I swung the door open, the biting Illinois chill rushed in, carrying with it the smell of cheap tobacco and overpriced cologne. Beckett Hayes stood on my porch, his face set in a mask of impatient authority. Behind him was a man I had never seen before. Mr. Miller, a real estate agent, with a shiny but poorly tailored suit and the predatory smile of someone who specialized in swindling the elderly, was already clutching a camera and a metal tape measure. He didn't even look me in the eye. His gaze was fixed on the crown molding of my entryway. "This is Mr. Miller," Beckett announced, stepping past me into the foyer without an invitation. "He is here to appraise this pile of rot, so we can get it on the market before the end of the week." I stepped into his path, my hands tightening into fists. "You have no right to set foot in here, and neither does your lapdog. Get off my property before I lose my patience." Miller let out a dry cough and clicked his camera, the flash blinding me for a split second as he took a shot of my living room. They treated me like a piece of furniture that needed to be liquidated, a mere obstacle on the path to a pile of cash. Beckett sneered, pulling a manila folder from his leather briefcase. He slapped it against his palm with a rhythmic, irritating sound. "Don't be difficult, Thane. We found the paperwork. This house was used as collateral for a private loan Alara took out last year. You signed it." I grabbed the folder from his hand, my eyes scanning the pages until I found the signature at the bottom. It was a masterpiece of deception. The curves of the G were almost perfect, but it was too clean, too steady, not the hand of a man with tremors. My own daughter and her husband had mortgaged my life while I was sleeping in their guest room. Miller tried to brush past me, his shoulder catching mine as he moved toward the kitchen with his tape measure. My anger flared like an old steel furnace. It was hot, dangerous, and impossible to extinguish. I grabbed him by the lapel and shoved him back toward the porch. "Get out," I roared. Beckett stepped in, his voice rising to a cold, jagged edge. "Sign the voluntary surrender, old man, and we will make sure you get a decent room at Autumn Leaves. Don't make us call the police to escort an incompetent man from the premises." "The police," I laughed, and the sound felt like gravel in my throat. "Please call them. I would love to show them the security footage from the hidden camera I installed last night. I would love to see how they feel about the forgery and the way you are threatening a heart patient." Beckett's face went pale, his smug confidence evaporating as he glanced nervously around the ceiling. He didn't know if I was bluffing, but the doubt was enough to stop him in his tracks. I grabbed my old wooden cane from the umbrella stand and pointed it directly at his chest. "Step one more inch across this threshold, and I will make sure you need a surgery more expensive than mine." Just as the silence turned deafening, the phone in my robe pocket began to vibrate. I pulled it out and saw the name on the screen. It was Lawrence. The phone call felt like a jagged blade cutting through the silence of my living room. The name on the screen, Lawrence, had always been a symbol of wisdom and family stability that I respected above all else. But today, as it vibrated against my trembling palm, it only carried the sour taste of cowardice and the slippery texture of excuses. "I am Thane Garrison, and I have spent my life standing on high beams and trusting the men beside me. But the air in this empty house had never felt thinner. I answered the call, my voice sounding like gravel. My brother Lawrence Garrison, a former accountant, who had spent 40 years prioritizing cold numbers over warm blood, didn't even give me a chance to speak. His voice was a low, gravelly drone, practiced in the art of sounding reasonable while delivering a betrayal. Thane, you have to be realistic. Lawrence started bypassing any genuine concern for my health. The kids have their own lives to live. You cannot keep being the anchor that drags them down into the depths of your own decline. The word anchor hit me with a dull thud. It was the same word Beckett had used. I realized then that this was a coordinated strike. Lawrence admitted with a chilling lack of remorse that he was the one who had advised Beckett on the legal framework to declare me mentally incompetent. He claimed it was the only way to fast-track the sale of the house so the proceeds could be managed for my own good. Have you ever heard the sound of your own heart breaking? It is not a medical event caused by a failing valve. It is the resonance of the last person you trust selling you out for a seat at someone else's table. I leaned against the cold, dry wall of the hallway, feeling the bitter taste of betrayal coating my tongue. I listened to him use flowery phrases like deserved rest and reducing the burden to mask the fact that he was siding with the wolves. That anchor you are talking about, Lawrence is the man who worked double shifts to put Alara through school and even bailed you out of your bad stock investments 5 years ago, I said, my voice steady despite the rage. Lawrence let out a sharp, dismissive huff through the speaker. You are living in a delusion of power, Thane. You are a retired site supervisor with a heart that is ticking like a time bomb. Autumn Leaves is the only logical choice because you simply do not have the liquid assets to survive anywhere else. I knew the truth about Autumn Leaves, a place where the smell of bleach couldn't hide the stench of neglect, where the elderly were tucked away like unwanted files in a drawer. Lawrence tried to talk over me, but I brought up the money he still owed me, the thousands he had promised to repay once his portfolio rebounded. He silenced me by saying I was being irrational and that my memory was clearly failing, further building the case for my incompetence. Everything became clear in that moment of icy silence between the static of the phone line. I was no longer a brother or a father. I was a hurdle to be cleared. I realized the true reason Lawrence was so desperate to push me into that warehouse for the dying. He owed Beckett a massive debt from a failed business venture, and my home, the only thing I had left, was the sacrificial lamb he was offering to wipe his own slate clean. I felt a strange, cold calm wash over me, a detachment that allowed me to see the battlefield for what it really was. I was entirely alone, and that made me dangerous. I hung up the phone while Lawrence was still mid-sentence, the dial tone, a final period at the end of our relationship. The exhaustion that had plagued me since the hospital vanished, replaced by a terrifying clarity of purpose. I looked at Alara's forged loan document one last time, then reached for my car keys on the counter. If they want to treat me like a madman, I will show them exactly what a man with nothing left to lose is capable of doing. The engine of my old truck roared to life, shattering the gloom of the neighborhood. I ignored the tightness in my chest, focusing entirely on the steering wheel. Why would the richest man in the city, a man whose life I had saved on a crumbling construction site 30 years ago, ask to see me on the very day I was prepared to lose everything? Arthur Sterling had been a young architect, then nearly crushed by a falling steel girder until I tackled him into a safety trench. We had not spoken in decades, but a courier had arrived with a summons that carried the weight of destiny. As I drove toward the Sterling Corporation headquarters, the skyscrapers seemed to lean in, watching my progress. I pulled my battered truck into the pristine circular driveway, a rusted relic among sleek European sedans. The security detail did not stop me. They were expecting the man in the faded work jacket. I was escorted directly to the 50th floor, where the air was thin, silent, and smelled of expensive sandalwood. Marcus, an executive lawyer with short-cropped silver hair and piercing eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses, who held the keys to the city's deepest secrets, stood waiting for me. He offered a solemn nod that suggested he knew my history better than I did. He guided me into a private office where the absolute silence felt like a heavy blanket. "Mr. Sterling always said he owed you more than just a life," Thane Marcus began. "He believed he owed you an empire." I leaned back in the plush leather chair, feeling the contrast between this luxury and my damp bungalow. "I just did my job that day," I replied. "I was not looking for a reward after 3 decades. Fate is like a massive crane. One second it can crush you, and the next, it can lift you out of the mud and place you on the clouds." Marcus opened a secure titanium box and activated a holographic display. A video message played, and there was Arthur looking frail, but his eyes still possessed that old architectural fire. "Thane," he said, his voice echoing, "you are the only man I ever met with true integrity. I have watched your life from the shadows, and I know exactly what your daughter and that snake Beckett are trying to do to you. I will not allow it." The screen flickered to legal documents. Marcus looked at me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "Arthur Sterling passed away 2 days ago, Thane. He has left the controlling interest of Sterling Corporation and its trust funds to you. You are now the primary beneficiary of $45 million. I felt the air leave my lungs. 45 million, Marcus. My heart actually has a physical problem. So please tell me you are not joking." He did not blink. "It is no joke, Chairman Garrison. You are the owner of this empire." Everything changed in an instant. From a man who could not afford heart surgery to someone who could buy the entire hospital. I stared at the digital signatures, my mind racing through the implications. But the shock was not over. Marcus leaned forward, his gold-rimmed glasses catching the light. "There is one more thing you should know. The real estate brokerage Beckett is using to seize your home, the one trying to bulldoze your life for a parking lot, is a subsidiary of Sterling Corp. You did not just inherit a fortune, Thane. You just became the boss of the men who are hunting you." Marcus pushed a sleek black titanium card and a stack of legal authorizations across the mahogany desk toward me. "Congratulations, Chairman Garrison. What is the first thing you would like to do to the people who hurt you?" I looked at the card, then up at the panoramic view of the city I had helped build. I smiled, a cold, sharp expression I had never seen in the mirror before. I felt power humming in the card, a weapon far more effective than any wooden cane. I was no longer a survivor. I was the architect of their ruin. The first thing I did was not schedule my heart surgery, but call my son-in-law's bank. As I lay in the hushed luxury of a VIP suite at Chicago Central Hospital, the cold weight of the titanium black card sat on the bedside table, catching the sterile fluorescent light. I was staring at that sliver of metal when the sharp, rhythmic click of Ilara's stiletto heels echoed down the hallway. My daughter was not coming here to put flowers in a vase. She was coming to uproot the last remains of my life. The heavy scent of hospital-grade antiseptic filled my nostrils as she pushed open the door, her eyes immediately scanning the room with a look of practiced annoyance. "Honestly, Dad, this hospital is far too expensive," she said, her voice dripping with artificial concern. "We discussed the budget. Beckett is stressed enough without these luxury bills piling up." She didn't realize that Marcus had personally arranged this suite, or that I was no longer a charity case on her ledger. As she sat at the edge of my bed, I noticed a designer shopping bag tucked under her arm, a brand I knew cost thousands. It was a bitter revelation. Just an hour ago, I had received an alert from my bank. Ilara had Lean Loot withdrawn the final $5,000 from my funeral savings account. She had literally spent my burial money on a handbag before coming to visit my sickbed. Are you here to say goodbye or to take a final inventory of my assets, Ilara? I asked, my voice as steady as a winter morning. She huffed, reaching into her bag to pull out a thick stack of legal documents. The sound of the paper soot against the crisp hospital sheets felt like a slap. Don't be dramatic, Dad. The doctor says you need long-term peace and quiet. Autumn Leaves is a perfectly adequate facility, and the money from the bungalow sale will finally clear Beckett's debts so we can breathe again. She placed a pen on top of the transfer papers, pushing them toward my weak hand. Is there a medicine in this world that can heal a heart crushed by its own child? Perhaps not, but $45 million can certainly buy a hell of a lot of justice. I looked at the papers, then at her. She didn't even notice the high-end monitoring equipment or the fact that the head of cardiology had visited me twice this morning. Greed had blinded her so completely that I had become invisible to her, except as a signature. Sign it, Dad, she urged, her voice sharpening. I'll make sure you get the best room they have within reason. Don't make Beckett lose his temper again. He's already in a meeting with the developers. I reached out my fingers, grazing the cool titanium card hidden under my pillow for a moment, before I picked up the pen. I didn't sign. I simply held it, watching her face. Have you ever wondered, Ilara, if I actually had money, would you treat me differently? She laughed, a short, hollow sound that had no joy in it. Let's stick to reality, Dad. You don't, and we can't keep pretending. She stood up, checking her watch, clearly done with the charade of daughterly affection. I'm leaving the papers here. Beckett needs them by tonight. She turned on her heel and walked out without a hug, without a single wish for luck in the upcoming surgery. There was only the dry, hollow sound of her heels fading into the distance. As soon as the automatic door hissed shut, I reached for my phone. I didn't call the nurse. I called Marcus. Freeze every real estate project Beckett Hayes has in the pipeline. I commanded, my voice booming with a power I hadn't felt in years. Start by revoking the license of Miller's brokerage. I want him crippled by noon. I hung up and felt my phone vibrate almost instantly. A message from my new attorney appeared on the screen. Understood, Chairman Garrison. The asset lockdown on Beckett Hayes has been activated. In Beckett's office, the phones began to ring like a chorus of death knells for his career. I could almost imagine the panic on his face as the empire he thought he was stealing began to dissolve under my command. Wealth can buy the softest bed in the world, but it cannot buy a steady heartbeat when your soul is being eroded by the cold indifference of your own blood. I lay in my VIP suite staring at the financial reports Marcus had sent, clear evidence of Beckett's systematic fraud, when the air suddenly felt like lead. A sharp, searing pain shot through my chest, like a rusted spike being driven through my sternum. My vision blurred, the high-end medical monitors around me spinning into a dizzying vortex of white and chrome. Panic flared, not for the power I had just gained, but because the primal instinct of a father was screaming for a lifeline. I reached with a trembling hand for my personal phone, my breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. I realized then that Ilara was at a luxury spa celebrating with a mineral mud bath and lavender essential oils. She was using the very money she had embezzled from my funeral fund to toast to her belief that Beckett had successfully tricked me into signing over the house this morning. I dialed her number, the ringing tone echoing in my ear like a distant bell. My heart rate climbed 140, 150, the world collapsing around me at the very moment I held it in my grasp. "Please, Ilara, pick up." I wheezed, my arm going numb with a chilling cold. My heart is not just suffering from a defective valve. It is being eaten away by the poison of her apathy. Across the city, in a sanctuary of steam and false peace, I knew she was looking at her screen with disgust. She probably muttered about how the old man was starting to whine again, before pressing the decline button, leaving me to face the gathering shadows alone. The call went to voicemail. "Hey, this is Ilara," the recording said with a chipper, hollow lilt. "I am enjoying some much-needed me time, so please leave a message after the beep." I slumped back against the pillows, the phone slipping from my sweat-slicked fingers. "I just wanted to hear your voice one last time," I whispered into the empty air, but the only response was the frantic, rhythmic chirping of the EKG machine. Beep, beep, beep. The heart monitor was the only honest friend I had left in that moment. It didn't care about my $45 million. It only cared about the failing biological pump it was tethered to. As my consciousness began to flicker like a dying neon sign, a nurse rushed into the room, her face a mask of professional alarm. She grabbed my phone to put it on the table, but she accidentally hit the speaker on a newly arrived message. Ilara's voice filled the room, laughing in the background of a recording, joking with a spa attendant about how she hoped the old man would just pass away soon, so she could finally be free of the burden. The nurse froze her eyes, widening in horror as she looked at me, but I was already drifting. Red lights began to flash against the ceiling, as the emergency code sounded a jagged siren for a man who had everything and nothing all at once. My eyes drifted toward the dark window, my spirit hardening into something colder than the titanium card on my nightstand. If I survive this night, Ilara Garrison will never find a single crumb from the sterling empire she so desperately craves. The team of doctors flooded the room, their voices a distant hum, as the shadows finally surged forward to claim me. My last coherent thought was a vision of the phone screen illuminated with the words, "Call declined, a final testament to a bond that had been severed by greed." The blinding light of the operating room slowly gave way to a hazy white brilliance as my consciousness clawed its way back from the deep abyss. The first thing I noticed was not the lingering surgical pain, but the rhythm. The rhythmic thumping in my chest was no longer the erratic, exhausted stutter of a dying old man. It was powerful, steady, and cold, like a mechanical clock counting down to the ruin of those who left me to die alone. I opened my eyes to the sterile perfection of a private recovery wing, realizing the sharp smell of harsh disinfectants had been replaced by the subtle, expensive aroma of freshly roasted coffee and polished wood. Marcus was there, sitting quietly in a high-backed leather chair by the window, his gold-rimmed glasses catching the harsh morning light. "Welcome back, Chairman. Your new heart is performing perfectly," he said, his voice a calm anchor in my foggy mind. I took a very slow breath, feeling the slight pull of the incision on my chest, a dull numbness that reminded me of the steep price of survival. "It is more than just a heart, Marcus. It is a weapon," I whispered. My voice was raspy, but the iron resolve behind it was absolute. Before the heavy sedation had even fully lifted, I demanded to see my personal phone. I scrolled through the logs, searching for a single sign of remorse or even basic curiosity. Nothing. In the 48 hours I had been under the knife, and in critical recovery, Ilara had not called once. She had not checked in, had not sent a single text, and certainly had not graced this hospital with her presence. I pulled up the remote feed from the hidden security cameras I had installed at my bungalow months ago. My jaw tightened as the digital image stabilized, Beckett was there, lounging in my living room, sleeping on my own bed, and drinking from my good bottle of scotch. He had moved into my home before my body was even cold on the operating table. Blood. It is surging through my veins now, carrying a promise of a cold, systematic purging of everything I once loved. Marcus stood up and handed me a sleek tablet, his expression unusually grim. They aren't just occupying the house, Thane. They are holding a celebration. Ilara and Beckett believe you are in a permanent coma and that the bungalow is legally theirs to keep. Beckett has even started listing your late wife's heirloom jewelry and old collectibles on auction sites for quick cash. I watched the screen, seeing my own daughter laugh as she pointed at the paintings her mother had cherished most. I felt no tears, only a terrifying crystal clarity. They are selling her memory. Good, I said, the words falling like shards of ice. Ilara has saved me the trouble of discarding the last remnants of my compassion. I have spent decades being the protector, the provider, and the fool who believed blood meant loyalty. Now the only thing that matters is the strategy for the end. Marcus, is the board ready? Everything is in place, Marcus replied. We have traced every debt Beckett Hayes owes. I looked at the reports. My son-in-law was drowning in high-interest loans to keep his failing real estate brokerage afloat. Do you think that kindness is infinite? No, it has a boundary, and I have just crossed that line forever. I am no longer a father begging for a phone call. I am the hurricane that is about to sweep away his entire world. Do not just freeze his assets, I commanded. I want you to buy the bank that holds his primary commercial loans. All of them. I want to become his direct creditor. I want his signature on every piece of paper I own. I set the tablet down, the blue light reflecting in eyes that held no warmth. Marcus, send Beckett a formal notice of immediate loan acceleration right now. I want him to understand exactly how it feels to be thrown out into the night, with nothing but the clothes on his back. I did not leave the hospital in a standard ambulance. Instead, a sleek, armored black SUV waited at the rear exit to whisk me away toward the man who would help me tear Beckett's shallow dreams into jagged little pieces. My heart beat with a rhythmic, artificial precision that mirrored my cold, internal resolve. We moved swiftly through the gray, rainy streets of Chicago toward a building without a nameplate in the high-stakes heart of the financial district. I was going to meet Attorney Vance, a lean man with eyes as sharp as a surgical razor and a flawless black suit. He was a professional known in elite circles as the Butcher for his uncanny ability to turn arrogant billionaires into desperate beggars in a single court session. As I entered his sanctuary, the intoxicating scent of expensive leather and aged paper filled my senses, providing a stark contrast to the white antiseptic walls I had just escaped. Thane, I have been expecting your arrival for a very long time, Vance said, offering a stiff, respectful nod. It was here I discovered that Arthur Sterling had actually hired him years ago to secretly protect my interests, waiting patiently for the moment I would finally be ready to seize my own power. We immediately began the process of deconstructing Garrison Structural Solutions, my former company, that Beckett had hijacked and renamed into his own gaudy image. Vance laid out a complex map of financial ruin. Beckett had hollowed the business out from the inside, using massive unsecured loans to fund a lifestyle of grotesque luxury, while the firm's core assets were rotting away. Do you want him bankrupt or do you want him in a cold cage? Thane, he asked, his voice completely devoid of human emotion. I want him to taste the exact moment of losing everything, just as he believes he has reached the highest summit, I replied. Have you ever wondered what is more terrifying than an enemy with nothing left to lose? It is a wealthy father who has nothing left to love. My daughter and her husband were currently celebrating their perceived victory, unaware that the ground beneath their feet was already liquefying into a swamp of debt. Vance pulled up a series of mortgage documents for my bungalow, highlighting the forged signatures that were amateurish but effective enough for a corrupt notary. Every one of those crooked marks is a final nail in his coffin, Vance remarked with a thin smile. We planned the restructuring with predatory focus, moving pieces like grandmasters on a board. By using the debt Sterling Corporation had just acquired, I could initiate an immediate hostile takeover and asset reclamation. I want everything back, Vance. The company, the bungalow, and even the bank accounts Ilara thinks are safely hidden. My daughter chose her side, and that side no longer has a place for me. I sipped a glass of cold water, but it felt like drinking the blood of my enemies as I reviewed the list of properties slated for immediate seizure. Justice in my hands is not a balanced scale. It is a massive stone crusher, and I have just pressed the heavy start button. I felt a cold, exhilarating hum in my chest as I realized the depth of the rot I was about to excise from my life. Vance then leaned forward, sliding a final heavy folder across the polished desk toward me. There is one more betrayal you should see, Thane. Beckett is not just stealing from you. He has been having a secret affair with your brother Lawrence's private secretary. He has been using her to funnel sensitive financial data from the entire Garrison family to ensure no one could stop his climb. I picked up the heavy fountain pen and signed the final reclamation order, the ink drying as black as my new intentions. Begin the process, Vance. Let us show them what a Monday morning really looks like when their entire manufactured world detonates from within. I stood up, feeling stronger than I had in a decade. The phantom pains of my old life replaced by the sharp electric clarity of the hunt. Money does not simply vanish into thin air. It merely migrates from the pockets of those who toil to the coffers of those delusional enough to chase luck. I sat in the armored SUV, feeling the steady thrum of my new heart, and wondered just how much of my family's future Beckett had set ablaze on a whim. The champagne might be flowing at my bungalow right now, but that celebration is nothing more than the final flare of a dying star before the total darkness of the storm arrives. My first stop was a place of silence and dust. Silas, my old friend and a retired chief accountant, whose hands shook with Parkinson's, but whose mind for numbers remained as sharp as a high-end processor, sat waiting for me in the deep shadows of an old library. The air was heavy with the scent of decaying paper and ancient wisdom. Silas did not waste time with pleasantries. He slid a thick stack of financial records across the oak table, the paper rustling like dry leaves. Beckett has been busy, Thane Silas whispered, his eyes narrowing. He established a network of shell companies to siphon millions from Garrison Structural Solutions. He even used a set of falsified medical records belonging to you as collateral for a massive predatory loan. He told the lenders you were already brain dead and that he would inherit the entire estate within the month. I stared at the ledgers, seeing the cold, hard proof of his treachery. Millions of dollars had been funneled into Atlantic City casinos under the guise of consulting fees. The betrayal cut deep, but it was the calculated nature of his greed that truly repulsed me. Thank you, Silas. I needed these numbers to nail him to the cross of his own making. Embezzlement, gambling, betrayal. It is a perfect trinity for the destruction of a life, and Beckett has mastered all three with terrifying ease. I left the library and stepped into the back of a waiting sedan where Elias, a private investigator with a disheveled appearance but an underground information network that spanned the entire city, was already exhaling a thick cloud of cheap tobacco smoke. The yellow glow of the street lamps flickered across the interior of the cramped car. Thane, your son-in-law is drowning, Elias grunted, handing me a folder of surveillance photos. These pictures showed Beckett in high-stakes VIP rooms flanked by my brother Lawrence's secretary. He owes a violent group of loan sharks a fortune, and he is planning to sell your bungalow within the next 48 hours to pay them off. He is a cornered animal, and a starving beast will do anything to survive. Good, I thought, feeling a predatory chill. I will be the one to sever his last hope of survival. Beckett thinks he is playing a high-stakes game of cards, with destiny itself. He has no idea that I am the house, and I have just swapped the deck. As I reviewed the final reports from Silas, a new piece of information surfaced that made my blood run cold. Ilara knew. The records showed she had been tracking the embezzlement all along, but she remained silent because Beckett promised to use his winnings to buy her a secluded mansion in the suburbs. My own daughter had traded my life and my legacy for the dream of a bigger garden. The bitterness of the cheap cigarette smoke in the car matched the taste in my mouth. I closed the folder, the weight of the documents feeling heavier than my own life. I have spent years providing a shield for people who were secretly sharpened daggers pointed at my back. Elias, get the car ready for tomorrow morning. Tomorrow is Friday, and I have a very special surprise party planned for my daughter and her husband. I took out my phone and dialed a number I had not called in years, one that bypasses secretaries and assistants. Chief Inspector, I said, when the line connected, it is Thane Garrison. I have a delivery of evidence that requires your immediate and personal attention. The dawn of Friday did not bring warmth. It only brought enough light for me to see the total collapse of those who had betrayed me. My meeting with the chief inspector was set, but before the hammer could fall, I needed to see the full scale of the rot with my own eyes. Detective Elias led me into the belly of an underground casino known as the Vault. The darkness inside was thick, suffocating with the heavy scent of expensive cigar smoke and the metallic tang of desperate sweat. I stood hidden behind a wall of one-way glass, watching my son-in-law Beckett Hayes place a frantic bet on a spinning roulette wheel. He looked haggard, his eyes bloodshot and twitching as he watched the white ball bounce against the future of my family legacy. Elias tapped on a heavy metal door, and we were ushered into a small, cramped office. Inside sat the bookie, a bloated man with thick fingers adorned in heavy gold rings, who sat in a room that reeked of dirty money and unwashed bodies. He was the ledger keeper for the fallen elite, the man who knew exactly how much every silver spoon brat in Chicago owed the underworld. He leaned back his chair, creaking under his massive weight, and tossed a stained notebook onto the desk. "Your boy is in deep garrison. Over $200,000 in just the last 2 weeks," he grunted. I felt a surge of pure contempt. He owes $200,000. That amount could have bought the honor of his entire family line if any of them possessed it. Beckett Hayes has no honor left to sell, Mr. Garrison, Elias added quietly. He only has his life and the false promises he made to the sharks. I looked at the numbers, realizing Beckett had not just gambled away embezzled cash. He had taken out high-interest loans using Ilara's expected inheritance as a guarantee. Do you know what it feels like to watch your own flesh and blood dig a hole meant to bury you? It does not sting like a heart attack. It is something much colder, a frost that settles deep in the marrow of your bones. As I watched the surveillance monitor, I saw the ball land on black. Beckett had bet everything on red. He began to scream a pathetic, animalistic sound, clawing at the dealer and begging for more time. It was then that I noticed a name on the ledger that didn't belong. The primary financier backing this gambling den was an old rival of Arthur Sterling, a man who had spent decades trying to dismantle everything we built. He wasn't just taking Beckett's money. He was using my son-in-law as a crowbar to pry open the Sterling Empire. Do not let the police touch him yet. I told Elias, my voice sounding like gravel under a boot. I want him to crawl toward me before he ever sees a courtroom. I want to buy every cent of his debt. I will become his only creditor, the one man who owns every breath he takes. 200,000, a small price to pay to see the absolute bottom of a man's soul. I walked out of the casino, the freezing Chicago morning air stinging my lungs. The neon red lights of the club entrance flickered, reflecting off the damp, oily pavement. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a message from Marcus. My heart, the new one, stayed steady as I read it. Ilara had just signed a private loan agreement using my bungalow as collateral to bail out Beckett's losses. She had just finished tying the noose around her own neck. I ignored her incoming call, my fingers moving with surgical precision as I typed a single reply. Meet me at the bungalow at 9 a.m. sharp. Bring every document you have signed. The storm had finally made landfall. I stepped into the SUV, the heavy door closing with a final echoing thud that sounded exactly like the closing of a tomb. The small bungalow was bathed in the deceptive peace of early morning, but inside the stench of betrayal was thicker than ever. I sat in a neutral gray sedan, maintaining just enough distance to remain undetected as Beckett's flashy sports car peeled away from the driveway. They were not heading to our scheduled 9 a.m. meeting to discuss the documents I had demanded. Instead, they were speeding toward the affluent neighborhood of Winnetka, busy buying a new life with the money they believed they had stolen from my corpse. I followed them, my hands steady on the steering wheel, my new heart beating with a cold, predatory rhythm. When they pulled into the driveway of a sprawling $2 million estate, and I used my Sterling Corporation credentials to bypass the perimeter security and slip inside the house under the guise of an interested corporate buyer. I watched from the shadows of a recessed hallway as Ilara and Beckett toured the marble-clad rooms. With them was an agent, a middle-aged woman in a stiff business suit, whose face was fixed in the permanent artificial smile of someone who only cared about the commission on a 7-figure deal. I overheard the agent mention that the mortgage application was already being processed, using my name as the primary guarantor. Beckett had forged my signature yet again, intending to make me the fall guy if their lavish lifestyle collapsed. Ilara ran her hand over a kitchen island, her eyes dancing with greed. Beckett, I want the dressing room to be at least twice the size of my father's bedroom at the bungalow, she said. Beckett laughed, patting her waist with a proprietary air. Do not worry, darling. Once we finish liquidating the rest of the old man's dusty heirlooms, this entire place will be ours. Their greed was like a black hole, a gravitational force that swallowed every memory and every ounce of familial affection, and now it was preparing to consume them whole. They moved into the grand living room, where a bottle of expensive champagne sat chilling in a silver bucket. The sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off the polished surfaces. Beckett popped the cork with a celebratory flourish, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the hollow house. As they poured the bubbling liquid, Ilara reached into her designer purse and pulled out a crumpled envelope. I recognized the hospital logo immediately. It was the unpaid invoice for my heart surgery. She glanced at the total and let out a mocking snort. Hospital bills. Let the public system handle it, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. We need this 200,000 for the deposit on this mansion. Besides, the old man still thinks his insurance covers everything. She balled up the life-saving document into a tight sphere and tossed it into a gold-plated wastebasket in the corner of the room. Clink. The sound of their glasses touching sent a shiver of ice through my veins. It was the sound of my heart freezing over for the very last time. "A toast to our freedom," Ilara Beckett shouted, raising his glass high. They drank deeply, celebrating a victory built on the ashes of my life. Suddenly, the agent's phone buzzed. Her artificial smile faltered as she listened to the caller. "I am terribly sorry," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "I just received word that the estate was purchased in full with a cash offer 5 minutes ago. The new owner has issued a trespass notice and demands that you vacate the premises immediately." Ilara's glass froze halfway to her lips, her face draining of color. I stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, adjusting the sleeves of a bespoke suit they had never seen me wear. The security team I had summoned moved in behind me, their presence an immovable wall. "Is the champagne to your liking?" I asked, my voice as calm as the surface of a lake before a devastating storm. I watched the bubbles die in their glasses as the reality of my presence began to sink in. Why is it that those who are most willing to cast their own kin into the grave are always the first to beg for mercy at the mere sight of money? Ilara's face turned as pale as a corpse, her hands trembling so violently that the champagne glass she held rattled against her wedding ring before the wine finally spilled onto the cold marble floor. I watched her, my expression as unyielding as the stone under her feet. Beckett stepped forward, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He tried to muster that oily confidence he usually wore, but his voice cracked. "Thane, you should be in the hospital. The doctor said you were dying." I walked closer, the clicking of my expensive leather soles echoing like a countdown. "Dying?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. "Or perhaps I have just become the nightmare you never saw coming." Ilara sneered for a brief second, trying to convince herself that I was a fraud. She whispered to Beckett that I must have borrowed the bespoke suit, that it was all an act. But the mockery died in her throat when a fleet of black sedans from Sterling Global, led by an armored SUV, pulled into the driveway. My security detail fanned out across the manicured lawn. I stood on the porch of the mansion I now owned, looking down at them with a bitterness that tasted like copper. They began to stutter, weaving a desperate web of lies about how they were only here surveying properties to fund my medical expenses. I listened in silence, watching the sweat bead on Beckett's forehead. Silence. Only the sound of the wind whistling through the ancient oak trees remained, and the muffled sound of Beckett's heart shattering into pieces. He tried to threaten the real estate agent, claiming his high-level position at the firm gave him immunity, but I was already moving past his words. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, dialing a direct line to Ms. Sterling. She was the head of human resources for the conglomerate, a woman with a voice forged of cold steel and an absolute unwavering loyalty to the Sterling name. I pressed the speakerphone button so the entire driveway could hear the verdict. President Garrison, Ms. Sterling's voice boomed through the crisp morning air. "The emergency audit is complete. As per your instructions, I have frozen all year-end bonuses, commissions, and expense accounts for all senior personnel at the regional branch, effective immediately. This includes the total lock on all accounts associated with Beckett Hayes." I looked Beckett in the eye as he began to tremble. "Thank you, Ms. Sterling," I replied. "Please have the embezzlement files prepared for the authorities. Do you see now, justice doesn't need to be loud or theatrical. Sometimes it only requires the single press of an enter key." The smell of gasoline from my idling escort vehicles filled the air, mixing with the scent of freshly cut grass. Beckett's phone began to vibrate incessantly in his hand, a barrage of digital rejections from his banks. Every credit line, every safety net he had painstakingly stolen was vanishing in real time. He looked at me, his eyes bloodshot, with a mix of terror and animalistic desperation. Then the man who had tried to sell my home while I lay on an operating table collapsed onto the expensive turf. "Dad, please. I can explain. I just needed to secure our future." He sobbed, clutching at the grass. He finally confessed the truth. In his panic, he had secretly diverted the employee's salary fund to make the deposit on this very mansion. By freezing the bonuses, I had effectively trapped him in a crime of capital misappropriation. I checked my watch, the sunlight glinting off the crystal face. "You have exactly 5 minutes to finish your explanation," I said, offering a small, merciless smile. "Because that is how long it will take for the police to reach this gate." The sirens of the police cruisers wailed from the distance, tearing through the curated silence of the Winnetka elite as they converged on the mansion. I watched through the rearview mirror as Beckett was surrounded by officers, his knees hitting the grass in a display of pathetic submission. I didn't stay to watch the handcuffs click shut. My work at the estate was done. I leaned back into the cool, dark leather of the Sterling SUV, the scent of expensive sandalwood and success filling the cabin. There is a sound more wretched than a child's cry, and that is the whimpering of a grown adult realizing their unlimited black credit card has just transformed into a worthless piece of plastic. My phone buzzed in my hand, vibrating with the frantic energy of a trapped animal. It was Ilara. I answered, and the speaker crackled with her panicked breathing. "Dad, oh my God, there's a terrible mistake at the bank." She stammered, her voice stripped of the arrogance I had heard at the spa. "I was at the boutique, and all my cards were declined. I need a small loan, just $50,000 to clear this up. It's some sort of glitch." I listened to her desperation, feeling the city lights flicker across my face. "The only mistake here, Ilara, is your belief that I am still your personal ATM." I let the silence hang for a moment, savoring the shock on the other end of the line. Before she could launch into another excuse, I dropped the first heavy truth. "By the way, I have officially purchased the private debt you took out against my bungalow. That means I am now your landlord, and your grace period has just expired." How much is fatherly love worth to Ilara? It was evidently only equivalent to the credit limit on a platinum card. She began to sob, a hollow, manipulative sound I had heard too many times before. She started invoking my late wife's name, pleading for mercy in the name of her mother. My grip on the phone tightened. "You have the audacity to mention your mother," I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You sold her heirlooms while I was still on the operating table. You threw my life-saving medical bills into the trash like they were junk mail. The era of my tolerance ended the moment you decided I was worth more to you as a corpse than as a father. I am not spending another cent on someone who prayed for my heart to stop beating." "But Dad, I don't have the money to pay Beckett's creditors," she screamed. "They will kill him if he doesn't pay." I looked out at the passing skyline, cold and indifferent. "Then I suggest you hope that the sincerity Beckett showed you is worth more than the debts he left behind. Perhaps he can pay them with the lies he used to win you over." Hanging up. Silence. There was only the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic, precise beating of my new heart. I felt no regret, only a profound sense of closure. My daughter had spent years sharpened like a dagger behind my back, and I had finally pulled the blade out. I turned to Marcus, who was watching the traffic ahead with professional detachment. "Notify the debt recovery team I commanded. Tomorrow morning that bungalow must be cleared and vacant. I have other plans for that property, something that actually honors my wife's memory." As the car sped toward the Sterling headquarters, a notification pinged on my tablet. It was an encrypted message from the lead investigator at the precinct. Beckett had started talking, and he wasn't just discussing tax evasion or embezzlement. He was offering up something far more dark and significant. Beckett just mentioned a detail about the accident that took your wife's life years ago, the message read. He claims it wasn't an accident, and he has the evidence to prove who was really behind the wheel. My blood turned to ice as I stared at the glowing screen. The storm hadn't passed. It was just changing direction. The screech of tires against the gravel driveway signaled that my enemy had finally arrived. It was not the submissive approach of a guilty son-in-law coming to beg for forgiveness, but the heavy, frantic breathing of a cornered beast looking to tear into its master. I sat on the porch of my bungalow, the evening wind whistling through the wooden slats, carrying the scent of impending rain. Beckett Hayes erupted from his car, his clothes disheveled and his eyes bloodshot from a lack of sleep and the sheer panic following his preliminary interrogation at the precinct. He didn't know I had the full weight of Sterling Global behind me now. To him, I was still just a frail old man recovering from surgery who could be easily bullied into submission. He marched up the stairs, his footsteps heavy and uneven, and slammed a folder of property transfer documents onto the small wicker table. "Sign it, you old fool. I don't have time for a lecture or your silent judgments," he roared, his voice cracking with desperation. He spat out that he had managed to secure a temporary release by bribing a low-level clerk with the last of Alara's emergency savings. He truly believed that if he could just get his hands on the title to this bungalow, he could flip it for enough cash to pay off the sharks and vanish before the real charges landed. I looked at the papers and then back at him, my face a mask of calm. "Do you honestly believe violence will save you from the mountain of debt you have built, Beckett?" I asked. He lunged at me, his fingers curling into the fabric of my shirt, and shoved me back against the porch pillar. My heart beat. Strong. Steady. It was a war machine now, not a withered piece of tissue failing in my chest. The slight sting at my incision site was a reminder of what I had survived, but it didn't trigger fear. It triggered a cold, calculating rage. Beckett pressed his forearm against my throat, his sour sweat stinging my nostrils as the red sunset cast long, blood-colored shadows across his distorted face. "You think I am joking?" He hissed, his breath hot against my cheek. "One hard punch to your chest, and you will be on your way to see your wife in the afterlife. Just sign the damn papers and I might let you live through the weekend." I didn't flinch. I reached down and discreetly activated the recording device hidden in my cufflink, making sure every syllable of his threat was captured for the permanent record. "Try it." I whispered, my voice barely audible over the wind. "But remember that every second your hands are on me, the price of your freedom doubles. You are holding on to a man who owns everything you have ever touched." Beckett's hands trembled on my collar, like a man trying to grip a rotting rope over a deep abyss. He was losing his grip on reality, his mind fractured by the pressure of his own failures. He leaned in closer, his teeth bared. "You should have died that night, Thane." I stood there in the living room, watching the clock, waiting for the life to drain out of you before I ever picked up the phone for the paramedics. You were supposed to be a memory, not an obstacle. The admission hung in the air, heavier than the humidity of the coming storm. He had sat there, feet away from my dying body, hoping for the silence of my heart. I looked into his eyes and saw the void where a human soul should have been. I didn't need to speak. Beckett raised his fist, his face twisted with a hatred so pure it was almost blinding. "Sign it, or die," he screamed. Just as his arm began to swing, a tiny piercing dot of red laser light appeared squarely in the center of his forehead. The metallic click of a bolt-action rifle being readied echoed from the darkness of the oak trees at the edge of my garden. Beckett froze, the blood draining from his face as he realized he wasn't the hunter anymore. My enemies thought they had stripped me of everything, but they forgot that an old lion becomes 10 times more dangerous when he is finally draped in new armor. The red laser light from the previous night had been nothing more than a high-end security toy used by my team to rattle Beckett's fragile nerves. Yet it worked better than any physical blow. In his cowardice, he had babbled until he revealed the exact floorboard in my bungalow, where he had hidden the encrypted files he stole from my study. With those documents back in my possession, the final pieces of his coffin were ready to be nailed shut. I spent the early hours of Monday morning at a discreet Savile Row tailor in the heart of the city. The old tailor was a short man, with a measuring tape draped perpetually over his shoulders. A man who had measured the most powerful figures in Chicago for over 40 years, and had served my father before me. He moved with a quiet precision, the sharp snip of his shears through heavy wool sounding like the cutting of ties to my old broken self. "This suit is not just fabric, Mr. Garrison," he whispered, pinning the shoulder of a midnight blue three-piece. "It is authority." I looked at my reflection and barely recognized the man staring back. I was no longer the gray, hollowed-out figure from the hospital bed. I was a man of industry once again. Just make sure it is comfortable enough for me to watch Beckett kneel without a single crease appearing in the fabric. I told him, the bitterness in my voice replaced by a cold, sharp confidence. I could smell the rich scent of high-grade wool and feel the weight of the silk lining a tactile reminder that I was reclaiming my throne. By 8 a.m., I was seated in a private VIP lounge, the early morning sun glinting off the fine china as I sipped a cup of black tea. Across from me sat Vance, his briefcase open to reveal a stack of legal documents that smelled of fresh ink and impending doom. We went over the final indictment, a masterpiece of corporate law that detailed every forged signature Beckett had used to mortgage my home and every gambling debt he had laundered through our accounts. Before I reveal the detail in these papers that changes everything, are you still with me? Comment guilty or innocent, and add one short reason why you think Beckett chose to betray me so deeply. Please note, the next part includes some fictionalized details added to convey the emotional weight of this betrayal. If you prefer strictly factual accounts, you are free to stop here. Vance tapped a particular page on the table, his eyes as cold as mine. The arrest warrants are signed and ready, Thane. They are just waiting for your signal. I looked at the indictment, feeling the heavy metal weight of my family's heirloom Patek Philippe watch against my wrist. Do not have the police take him too early, I commanded. I want him to taste the full measure of his public humiliation in front of the entire board of directors first. I want him to see me walk through those doors and realize his world has ended before the handcuffs ever touch his wrists. Vance nodded, informing me of one final victory. Beckett's contact at the illegal casino had agreed to testify against him. The man preferred to see Beckett burn rather than watch me dismantle his entire underground gambling network. I stood up and adjusted my cuffs, the movement fluid and precise. I felt the cold metal of the watch face against my skin, a grounding sensation before the storm. I took one last sip of the bitter tea, the taste sharp and clear. "Vance, call the front desk at Garrison Structural Solutions," I said, my voice resonating with a power I hadn't felt in years. "Tell them their real chairman is on his way, and they should prepare the boardroom for a cleansing. Before I reveal the detail in these papers that changes everything, are you still with me? Comment guilty or innocent, and add one short reason why you think Beckett chose to betray me so deeply. Please note, the next part includes some fictionalized details added to convey the emotional weight of this betrayal. If you prefer strictly factual accounts, you are free to stop here. The silence of a Sunday night often brings peace to others, but for me it was the heavy stillness of a loaded chamber waiting for dawn to fire. I sat in the dim light of my bungalow living room, the rhythmic chirping of crickets outside the only sound in the vacuum of the evening. A cup of chamomile tea sat forgotten on the coaster beside me, its steam long gone and the liquid grown cold and bitter. In the darkness, the blue glare from my smartphone screen felt like a physical intrusion, a digital window into the ugliness I was about to leave behind. Ilara was spiraling. A barrage of messages illuminated the room one after another, a desperate and venomous stream of consciousness that contained not a single word of regret. She accused me of sabotaging her future and called me a cold-blooded monster for hiding my true wealth while she and Beckett struggled to maintain their lifestyle. I felt a strange, detached clarity as I read her words. In her final, most frantic message, she inadvertently revealed the depth of their depravity they had already scouted an unlicensed, low-cost nursing home where they planned to dump me the moment the house was officially in their names. They didn't just want my money. They wanted me erased. I leaned back the shadows of the room, swallowing everything but the glowing screen. "I do not owe you a life of luxury, Ilara," I whispered to the empty air. "I only owe myself justice." Ting. Another message. More venom. I simply smiled. This was the final nail in the coffin of my paternal guilt. Every effort I had made to find a spark of humanity in them had been met with a strike of the match. The realization brought a profound serenity, a lightness I hadn't felt since before the surgery. My daughter wasn't a victim of my success. She was a predator who had failed to catch her prey. I stood up and began a final walk through the bungalow, not as a discarded father, but as a ghost visiting a tomb. I stopped at the hallway table where the old family photographs were displayed. I picked up a silver frame of us at the lake years ago and slowly turned it face down. It was a symbolic closing of a book that had already been burned. I checked my encrypted messages from Marcus one last time to confirm the morning schedule. Everything was in place. My bespoke armor was ready, my legal team was mobilized, and the trap was set. I walked back to the living room and picked up the old phone, the device that had been my only link to a world that had abandoned me. It was filled with ignored, missed calls and insulting texts that had once cut me to the bone. Turning off the power was like pulling the plug on a bomb that had already been diffused. The world out there might still be burning, but here in this quiet sanctuary, I was the master of the dark. The screen flickered and then died, the click of the power button echoing in the stillness like a final sentence. Farewell to the role of the pathetic dying father. Tomorrow the world would learn that Thane Garrison was very much alive. I looked at the dark glass of the phone, seeing my own reflection. The face of a man with nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. What Beckett and Ilara never realized was that their leverage was gone long ago. I had already signed the bungalow over to a foundation for victims of domestic abuse weeks ago. Their attempts at blackmail were legally worthless from the start. I was simply waiting for them to show me who they truly were. Now that I knew there was nothing left to say, I closed my eyes and let the silence take me, preparing for the storm I was about to unleash. The Monday morning sun bled across the glass panels of the Sterling office tower, a cold and clinical brilliance that mirrored my own resolve. I stepped out of the black limousine, my polished Oxford shoes hitting the pavement with a rhythmic snap that seemed to echo through the downtown canyon. The reflection on the leather was so sharp, I could see the sudden flicker of terror on the face of the lobby security guard as I approached. I didn't need a key card, and I certainly didn't need an invitation. I was the man who signed the checks to build this monument to corporate ambition. The night before, I had finalized one last move, quietly acquiring a critical 5% of floating shares through an anonymous trust. By the time my feet hit the granite floor of the lobby, I wasn't just a founder returning from the brink. I was the absolute majority shareholder. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors, and the atmosphere in the cavernous sand main floor froze instantly. The air, thick with the scent of expensive floor wax and early morning coffee, suddenly felt thin. Employees who had spent weeks whispering about my death or speculating on my terminal condition in some backwater hospital stood paralyzed. Their eyes tracked me like I was a ghost, conjured from the very stone beneath their feet. A young receptionist, her hand hovering over a telephone, let out a soft gasp. "Good morning, Chairman Garrison," she stammered, her voice trembling. We thought you were—" I stopped and offered her a small, razor-sharp smile. "Thought I was dead. It seems the rumors of my passing were somewhat exaggerated for dramatic effect." I continued my walk, the sound of my footsteps amplified by the sudden, stunned silence of the crowd. Have you ever felt that true power doesn't lie in weapons or shouting, but in the profound silence that follows you as you walk through a room of trembling people? I felt the weight of their gaze, a mixture of awe and primal fear as I moved toward the VIP security gates. My progress was momentarily halted by a new face. An imposing man with a jagged scar running through his left eyebrow stepped into my path, flanked by two other guards I didn't recognize. This was Elias Thorne, a 42-year-old former mercenary hired by Beckett as the new head of security to replace the loyalists I had cultivated over decades. He didn't know me, or perhaps he had been told I no longer held authority. "Sir, you aren't on the visitor list for today," Thorne said, his voice a low rumble. "I need to see some identification." I didn't reach for a wallet. Instead, I looked directly into the security camera mounted above the gate, knowing Marcus was positioned in the central control room, waiting for this exact heartbeat. "I am not a guest, Thorne," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I am the owner of the house. I suggest you step aside before you become a permanent footnote in this company's history." A long, sharp beep resonated from the gate console. Open. Every single security barrier in the lobby slid back simultaneously, a mechanical bowing of the head. It was as if the Red Sea had parted for Moses. I walked past Thorne without a second glance, leaving him staring at a console that no longer obeyed him. I reached the executive elevator, the one with the gold-plated doors that led directly to the heavens where the board of directors played at being gods. I placed my hand on the touch-sensitive panel, feeling the familiar coldness of the metal. Beckett had already tried to lock me out, changing my personal access code, but he had forgotten the master override I had programmed 20 years ago when this building was just a blueprint. I entered the ancient sequence, and the system yielded instantly. The doors slid shut, sealing me in a private cocoon of mahogany and brass. A small notification flickered on the elevator's internal display. "Beckett is in boardroom 1. He has no idea you are coming." I adjusted my cuffs and watched the floor numbers climb, ready to deliver the final judgment. The elevator gave a soft, melodic chime as it reached the 50th floor, a sound that usually signaled the start of a productive day, but now rang like a death knell for Beckett Hayes' short-lived empire. I walked toward the CEO office, the scent of cedar wood and expensive leather growing stronger with every step. I didn't head for the boardroom. I headed for my sanctuary. I spun the high-backed leather chair around and sank into it, feeling the familiar chill of authority seep through the fabric. This room had always been mine, and today it would serve as the courtroom for those who had tried to bury me while I was still drawing breath. I had been prepared for this since the moment Beckett started acting suspicious, having secretly installed micro cameras and high-fidelity recording equipment throughout my bungalow, turning my supposed recovery retreat into a perfect trap for gathering evidence. Outside the heavy oak doors, I heard a commotion. Beckett and Ilara were storming through the reception area, their voices shrill and demanding. Ilara was screaming at the CEO's secretary, Sarah Miller, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 20s who had spent years as my personal assistant and had quietly safeguarded my confidential files during my absence. Sarah didn't flinch as they demanded to know why the building's security had malfunctioned. They burst into the office, their faces flushed with the arrogance of people who thought they had already won. Beckett was in the middle of a sentence about trespassers when I slowly rotated the chair to face them. The silence that followed was absolute. Ilara's expensive designer handbag slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud, while Beckett recoiled as if a ghost had just stepped out of the shadows. "Dad, how can you be here?" Ilara stammered, her face turning a sickly shade of ash. "The hospital said you couldn't even leave your bed." I looked at her with a calm that seemed to unnerve her more than a shout would have. "The hospital gave you a report on my physical health, Ilara," I said softly. "But they didn't mention what I would do to the traitors in my own house. Do you know if there is a sound more beautiful than the pop of a champagne cork?" I asked them, though they were too stunned to answer. It is the sound of lies shattering beneath the weight of the truth. Beckett tried to regain his footing, stepping forward with a forced smile that didn't reach his terrified eyes. "Thane, listen, we were just worried we were coming to see." I didn't let him finish. I reached out and pressed a button on the mahogany desk. Instantly, the office's surround sound system came to life. The audio from the bungalow porch and that final venomous Sunday night call filled the room. Ilara's voice, cold and hateful, spoke about dumping me in an unlicensed nursing home. Then came Beckett's confession, the admission that he had stood by and watched the clock while I was dying, waiting for the light to leave my eyes before calling for help. The recording played with merciless clarity, stripping away every mask they wore. Click. The recording stopped. A deadly silence descended. "This wasn't me speaking, Ilara," I said, looking my daughter in the eyes. "These were your own words. And Beckett, you wanted me dead for a house. The only house waiting for you now is a 4-meter cell." Beckett's forehead was slick with a cold sweat that mirrored the gray light of the morning. Suddenly, the air was pierced by a scream. Ilara lunged at Beckett, her fingernails clawing at his face in a blind panic. It was him, she shrieked. "He made me do it. He said we needed the money. He forced me to leave you, Dad." She was ready to tear him apart to save herself. I watched with cold disgust. The door burst open. It was a team of detectives from the Economic Crimes Unit. I stood up, poured a finger of scotch, and felt the bite of the alcohol on my tongue. "Lead them out of my office," I told the officers, "and make sure they share the same police car. I want them to have plenty of time to discuss their next move." The metallic rattle of handcuffs snapping shut was the final melody of that Monday morning, a harsh percussion that signaled the end of a dynasty built on deceit. Have you ever wondered what a gambler feels like when they realize their final hole card is not an ace but a life sentence? I looked at Beckett Hayes, whose face had transitioned from the pale white of shock to the muddy gray of a man who realized he had been playing against a house that never loses. I stood behind my desk, the heavy mahogany providing a barrier between my new life and the wreckage of my old one. With a deliberate motion, I threw a thick stack of bank statements onto the surface. The rough texture of the paper seemed to grate against the silence of the room. $45,000, Beckett, I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. Is that truly the price you set for your freedom? He stared at the documents, his eyes darting across the figures. How did you find that Atlantic City account? I told them I closed it. I leaned forward, the faint scent of cedarwood from the office air mingling with the bitter smell of his fear. I knew about it, because I was the anonymous lender who advanced you that capital through a third-party shell company, I revealed. I watched you take the bait, saw you use that stolen money as a down payment for the Winnetka mansion, and tracked every cent as you laundered it through my own firm. You didn't just steal from me. You invited me to document your downfall. Lost. Beckett looked into the void, his eyes glazing over, as the reality of his situation set in. Everything he had constructed out of lies and greed was burning to ash right in front of him. I signaled to the building's security team waiting at the door. I am officially terminating Beckett Hayes for gross ethical violations and financial crimes, I announced. I watched as they stepped forward, the leader reaching out to rip the corporate ID badge from Beckett's neck. The sound of the plastic clip snapping was surprisingly loud. You don't deserve the private elevator, I told him, as he was being hauled toward the door. You will walk through the main lobby. Let every employee see the true face of the man who tried to play king. Ilara began to shriek, a high-pitched sound of desperation that clawed at the walls. You can't do this to me. I'm your daughter. I'm a Sterling. I didn't even look up from the papers on my desk as I slid a single sheet toward her. This is a notice of immediate repossession for the bungalow, I said coldly. You have until sunrise tomorrow to vacate. My compassion died the night you decided my heart was a commodity. I followed them out to the mezzanine, looking down at the lobby where hundreds of employees had gathered, their faces turned upward like a silent jury. Don't ever underestimate a man who has looked at death and decided to come back just to settle the score. The flashes from the cameras of the reporters I had secretly tipped off began to strobe a rhythmic white light that exposed every tremor in Beckett's hands as he was led toward the police cruisers. It was a public execution of a reputation. Once the doors closed and the sirens began to fade into the city traffic, the adrenaline that had sustained me began to recede, leaving a hollow ache in my chest, where the new heart beat with a heavy, insistent rhythm. I turned to Marcus, who was standing quietly by the elevators. Now, Marcus, find me the records of the donor for this heart, I said. It is time I thanked them in the only way a Sterling knows how. Beckett had tried to use my wife's death as a final weapon, whispering that he had proof she had taken her own life, rather than it being an accident. I simply pulled a genuine forensic report from my drawer, the one he had never seen, and watched his last lie crumble. My wife loved life as much as I do now. The elevator doors opened with a hiss, and I stepped inside, ready to find the soul behind my survival. The collapse of an empire often begins with a thunderous explosion, but the downfall of a parasite starts with a choked breath when they realize the host no longer allows them to draw blood. I stood in the main lobby of the Garrison building, watching as the police led Beckett away. Ilara stood frozen amidst the sea of marble and glass, her shadow stretching long and thin across the floor. She lunged toward me, her heels clicking frantically as she tried to grab my arm. Her expensive perfume, once a scent of status, was now cloying, mixed with the sharp, sour odor of panicked sweat. Dad, please, she sobbed, the tears carving tracks through her perfect makeup. You have to listen to me. It was all Beckett. He threatened me. He said if I didn't help him, I would lose everything. I am your own flesh and blood. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Flesh and blood did not stop you from leaving me to die alone in that bungalow, Ilara. Before I could say more, Lawyer Vance stepped forward. He was a man of cold precision, a legal shark who had served me for 3 decades. He didn't offer a handkerchief. Instead, he handed her a heavy, blue-bound legal folder. I watched her fingers tremble as she felt the cold weight of the documents. This is a civil suit for the recovery of $1.2 million in contingency funds you embezzled over the last 2 years, Vance stated, his voice echoing in the vast hall. Furthermore, here is the eviction notice for the Garrison-owned penthouse. You have 12 hours to remove your personal effects. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small tablet, turning the screen toward her. It showed a grainy black and white feed from a hidden camera I had installed near my bed. In the video, Ilara was clearly seen instructing a nurse to disable my monitoring equipment early because the beeping was annoying her. I watched the last shred of color drain from her face. What does the tear of a predator taste like? Perhaps it is only the salt of regret for being caught rather than the sting of genuine guilt. Ilara looked around at the lobby where dozens of employees, the same people she had treated like dirt for years, were now watching her with a mixture of pity and quiet satisfaction. She tried to open her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. Vance continued without mercy, explaining that every account in her name had been frozen by court order to preserve disputed assets. The black titanium credit card in her designer wallet, the luxury cars, and the very title of Mrs. Sterling were vanishing in real time. She looked like an expensive porcelain doll being fed into a stone crusher. Every bit of her arrogance was splintering into dust, revealing the terrifying emptiness beneath. "I will not sign anything," she screamed, her voice cracking as she collapsed onto the cold marble floor. "You cannot do this. The law does not require your signature to execute justice, Miss Sterling." Vance replied, his tone clinical. "Or should I call you Mrs. Hayes?" I turned my back on her, the sound of her wailing filling the lobby like a dying siren. I felt a strange, hollow victory. The vengeance was complete. But the man I used to be felt just as distant as the daughter I had lost. Marcus approached me as I moved toward the elevators, handing me a discreet yellow envelope. His expression was grimmer than usual. "Sir, we have the verification on the heart donor's family," he whispered. "There is a detail, something you need to see immediately before we proceed to meet them." I felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I took the envelope, the paper crisp under my thumb. While Ilara cried for the loss of her wealth, I realized I had traded my old life for a second chance that came with a price I hadn't yet understood. I moved away from the noise of the lobby, his heart thudding with a new anxious rhythm. My hand trembled slightly as I pulled the single sheet of paper from the yellow envelope. The name printed there was not a stranger. It was a name that had haunted the periphery of my consciousness for 10 years, a ghost from a past I thought I had settled. I looked at Marcus, whose silent gaze confirmed the weight of what I was reading. This was no mere coincidence. It was a cosmic irony that felt like a punch to my new ribs. I tossed the keys to the old bungalow onto the dust-caked wooden table. The dry metallic clatter echoed through the stagnant air of the small room, signaling that the games of power were over and the time for a restorative punishment had begun. I had driven Ilara back to the very place where she and Beckett had left me, to rot a derelict shack that smelled of damp wood and ancient neglect. Ilara stood in the center of the room, her designer coat looking absurdly out of place. She looked around with a shudder, her eyes wide with terror, as she realized the golden cage of the Sterling Empire had finally vanished. "This is where you left me to wither away, Ilara," I said, my voice echoing with a calmness that seemed to frighten her more than a shout. "Now you will taste the isolation you so generously gifted to me." I had already made secret arrangements for this place. While the exterior remained a decaying shell, I had discreetly installed a high-tech air filtration and heating system beneath the floorboards. I had no intention of letting her perish from the elements. I only wanted her to face the psychological void of her own making. "You have two choices," I continued, leaning against the doorframe. "You can face a 15-year sentence for embezzlement and attempted murder, or you can stay here for one night with no phone, no money, and no servants to consider your soul." One night, one choice, an entire life. Ilara's face was a mask of disbelief. "You can't be this cruel," she whimpered. "I'm your daughter," I didn't answer. I simply stepped out and locked the door, leaving her to the silence. The next morning, the gray light of dawn filtered through the cracked window panes. I returned to find a broken woman. Ilara had clearly not slept, her eyes bloodshot and her posture defeated. I placed a document on the table next to a plastic cup of bitter, lukewarm coffee. "This is the redemption contract," I told her. "You will work at an orphanage under an assumed name. You will live on a minimum wage, and you will report your every action to Marcus weekly. If you slip once, the prosecutor gets your file." Her signature on the paper was shaky, resembling a small ant, struggling to escape a pool of thick honey. "I'll sign," she whispered, the pen scratching harshly against the rough paper. "Just don't send me to prison." I took the paper from her, but I wasn't finished. "Before you go to start your new life, there is one thing you must know," I said, opening the yellow envelope again. "The man who gave his life so I could have this heart was named Elias Hayes. He was Beckett's estranged older brother, the one Beckett abandoned after a car accident years ago to avoid paying the medical bills. Beckett didn't just try to kill me. He effectively murdered the man whose heart is now keeping me alive through his own negligence." I stared at the name in the file, feeling the heart in my chest beat with a sudden heavy thrum of sorrow. The heart beating in my ribs belonged to a man whom my enemy had slain with indifference. "Marcus, get the car ready," I said, my voice tight with a new kind of resolve. "We aren't going to celebrate a victory. We are going to find this man's family." I left the bungalow behind the cold morning mist clinging to my coat as I stepped toward a future I hadn't expected. The sirens tearing through the midnight air at the state border were not merely the sound of justice, but a funeral dirge for a man who believed he could outrun the shadow of Thane Garrison. I sat in the back of my car, watching the GPS coordinates on my tablet. The cheap SUV Beckett had chosen for his escape was glowing like a beacon on my screen. He had no idea that the vehicle acquired through a middleman at a local dealership was my parting gift to him, outfitted with a military-grade satellite tracker long before he ever touched the steering wheel. He was carrying a suitcase full of embezzled cash, thinking he had won, but I had frozen his accounts and voided his passport days ago. I watched through a remote feed as he was pinned down at a border checkpoint. The headlights of police cruisers flooded his desperate face, reflecting off the windshield as he rolled down the window. "Do you not know who I am?" He screamed at the officers, his voice cracking with a cowardice he could no longer hide. "I am the CEO of Garrison." The lead officer didn't even flinch as he pulled his sidearm. "According to our records, Mr. Hayes, you are nothing but a fugitive with a warrant for your arrest." The engine of his escape vehicle roared one last time, before being silenced by the cold click of handcuffs. Have you ever wondered if forgiveness is a luxury that traitors can never quite afford to buy? I asked myself as the feed went dark. To me, Beckett was already a ghost, a remnant of a life I was systematically erasing. By the time Wednesday morning arrived, the storm had moved from the border to the iron gates of my new estate. I stood on the balcony of the Sterling Manor watching the rain lash against the stone. Below, a solitary figure stood shivering in the downpour. It was Lawrence, the only one I had not yet broken. He was leaning into the intercom, his voice distorted by the wind and the rain. "Dad, please," he cried out his words, reaching me through the speakers. I was wrong. I didn't know Beckett would go this far. I felt the salty tang of the morning air on my tongue as I looked down at him. He looked small, pathetic, and utterly useless. Marcus stood beside me, his hand hovering over the gate release. "Should I let him in, sir?" I shook my head slowly. "Ignorance is not a get-out-of-jail-free card, Lawrence," I muttered to the empty balcony. "It is simply a testament to your own incompetence." Click. I reached over and severed the intercom connection. The silence that followed was my final answer to him. A person who stands by while a murder is plotted is just as guilty as the one holding the blade. I watched as he slumped against the gate, the rain washing away his pride, until he was nothing more than a wet shadow. I turned away from the window, closing the heavy velvet curtains on that part of my life forever. I had a new mansion, a new company, and a new heart, yet the house felt colder than the bungalow ever did. I walked toward the grand foyer, ready to discuss the donor family search with Marcus. However, as I reached the marble hall, I stopped dead in my tracks. A young woman was standing there, her hair damp from the rain, and her face pale with an exhaustion that mirrored my own. Elena Hayes, a young woman with a gaunt face but a haunting beauty and deep eyes that held a world of sorrow, was clutching a small child to her chest. She was the widow of the man who died so I could live. Marcus bowed his head as he stood between us. "Sir, this is the wife of the donor," he said softly. "She says she has something that belongs to your heart." My breath hitched as Lawrence's desperate voice echoed in my mind one last time. He had called me on the way here, sobbing that Alara had been the one to tip off the border police about Beckett's SUV just to save her own skin. They were all still devouring each other, while here in front of me stood the only pure thing left in this story. I had always thought this heart was a biological debt, a replacement part required to finish my campaign of vengeance. But looking into the eyes of the child held by Elena Hayes, I realized I carried more than just someone else's life. I carried the weight of their unfinished dreams. The boy's eyes were wide and curious, strikingly similar to the sharp, intelligent gaze in the medical file I had pored over. Elena reached into her worn bag and handed me a letter. "My husband didn't know who would receive this," she said softly, her voice steady despite the U-shaped sorrow in her eyes. "But he believed his heart would find someone decent." I opened the parchment. The handwriting was firm, the words of a man who knew his time was short. He wrote of his hope that his recipient would live a life worth the sacrifice. As I read, a bitter truth emerged. Elias Hayes was a brilliant structural engineer who had once worked for Garrison Solutions. He was the man Beckett had fired 3 years ago for refusing to sign off on substandard safety materials for a high-rise project. Forced into grueling manual labor to support his family, he had eventually suffered the fatal accident that brought his heart to me. The irony was a physical weight in my chest. Beckett hadn't just tried to kill me. His greed had already claimed the man who saved me. "I will not promise I am a saint," I told Elena, my voice thick with a resolve that felt more vital than any business deal. "But I promise you, this heart will never have to feel ashamed again." I immediately instructed Marcus to establish a lifelong educational trust for the boy, and appointed Elena as the director of the Sterling Foundation's New Worker Safety Initiative. This was no longer about flaunting power. It was about balance. Do you think revenge is the final chapter? It is not. Revenge is merely clearing the site so you can build something that actually matters. A week later, I sat in my car outside a dusty construction site for the new Garrison Logistics Hub. I watched the surveillance feed on my tablet. Ilara was there, unrecognizable in heavy denim work clothes and a yellow hard hat. She was gripping a coarse broom, sweeping debris in the heat of the afternoon sun. I could see the sweat mucking up her forehead and the way her shoulders slumped from the unaccustomed labor. Under the watchful eye of Marcus, she didn't dare stop. She looked toward the camera, her expression a mix of exhausted rage. "I know you're watching me." She seemed to scream at the lens, though I couldn't hear her. "I hate you." I watched her for a long time. The hatred didn't bother me. For the first time, she was earning a meal with her own hands, learning the value of the sweat she had once mocked in others. This punishment was far more effective than a sterile prison cell. It was a confrontation with reality. Silence. Finally, there was only silence. I drove to the memorial park, where my late wife was buried. The air smelled of damp earth and the scent of cut grass. I walked to the headstone, the rhythmic, powerful thrum of my heart, steady in my ears. I had made one final move that morning. I had signed over my controlling voting rights not to Lawrence or any family member, but to a trust managed by a committee of the veteran employees Beckett had tried to purge. The company would belong to the people who built it. I placed a single white rose on the marble. The wind whistled softly through the rows of graves, but the sharp, stabbing pain in my chest was gone. I took out my phone and deleted the contact for Lawyer Vance. There were no more lawsuits to file, no more traps to set. Every debt had been settled, every betrayal accounted for. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the quiet air, a man with a second chance and a clear conscience. And to you, listening to my story, remember this: life is a mirror that reflects the kindness or cruelty you put into it. For too long, I focused only on building an empire, and it almost cost me my life. Don't make my mistake of valuing paper over people. My dad revenge journey wasn't about the money I lost, but the family I almost didn't find. I believe God gave me this second heart and a second chance to set things right, showing me that true legacy is built on mercy. This dad revenge taught me that justice is better served by building than destroying. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs a reminder to stay strong. What would you have done in my position? Let me know in the comments below. If you haven't yet subscribed for more stories of resilience, this dad revenge saga has come to a close, and I'm glad you were here to see it. Thank you for staying until the very end. Please note that certain fictional elements were added for storytelling, but the message remains true. God bless you.